you are spotlighted,
I am spotlighted. Right, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Dzień dobry. My name is Jarek Garliński and I am the host of today's meeting. This morning, I shall also be sharing this duty with my regular co-host, Chris Januszewski. On behalf of the Polish Heritage Society UK and the Institute of Polish Military History, I would like to welcome you to the second lecture of the third season of our Polish Military History series. I should also like to extend a warm welcome to those of you who were with us last year. Welcome back. The Institute of Polish Military History is the brainchild and an offshoot of the Polish Heritage Society UK. The aim of the Institute is to open a door to a field of study which has not hitherto received much attention outside the Polish-speaking world. And we hope that this lecture series might eventually lead to greater things. So do please stay with us for the duration, and do please sign up for the later lectures if you have not already done so. A little piece of housekeeping, if I may. For those of you who are experienced old hands, please forgive me for covering old ground. Professor Frost's lecture will be followed by 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A. You are indeed invited to ask questions, but they will be in written form to me and by way of the Zoom chat facility since, as is common in such events, all participants have been muted. If you have not already done so, please locate the chat button on your device, different devices having it in different places. I'd be grateful if you could please wait half an hour or so before sending in any questions. When the lecture ends, I shall then read out as many questions as we have time for. Indeed, in the interest of time, please try to keep your questions short. Could I also remind you, please, to address your questions to me, IPMH, and not to everyone. Now, this morning, it is a distinct pleasure to welcome a new guest, Professor Robert Frost of the University of Aberdeen, who will be talking to us about chicken coops and marauding foxes, military strategy in the Polish-Lithuanian Republic, 1569 to 1795. Robert Frost holds the Burnett Fletcher Chair of History at the University of Aberdeen. He grew up in Edinburgh and studied modern history at the University of St Andrews, where he developed an interest in Polish history. He then studied for a diploma in Polish language and culture at the Jagiellonian University Kraków between 1980 and 1981, and wrote his doctorate at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, University of London, under the supervision of Norman Davies. A revised version of his doctoral dissertation was published by Cambridge University Press in 1993 as After the Deluge, Poland, Lithuania, and the Second Northern War, 1655 to 1660. He taught at King's College London from 1987, and his prize-winning second book, The Northern Wars, War, State and Society in Northeastern Europe, 1558 to 1721, was published by Longman in 2000. He moved to Aberdeen in 2004, and he is currently writing a 3-volume history of the Polish-Lithuanian Union for Oxford University Press. In 2017, Volume 1, The Making of the Polish-Lithuanian Union, 1385 to 1569, published in 2015, won the Prohistoria Polonorum Prize for the best foreign language book on Polish history, published between 2012 and 2017. Volume 2, The Making of the Polish-Lithuanian Republic, 1569 to 1648, is nearing completion. Professor Frost, good morning. Delighted to have you with us.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for that very generous introduction. I hope I can live up to it. I will now lean forward towards the camera and share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint. Windows. Can you see that?
No.
No. Somehow the PowerPoint has disappeared. I'm not sure from the list of things I have.
It worked a moment ago.
It worked a minute ago. Oh, there it is. That's what I want to share. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes. Yes.
Right. I'm just going to move down the little thing so that I can see the PowerPoint. Right. The title will become clear. The meaning of the title will become clear as I talk. But I'd like to begin with this famous painting in the Frick Gallery in New York, or known as the Polish Rider, because in many ways this painting sums up what military historians tended to write about Poland-Lithuania. It is, as Zdzisław Żegulski has shown, a fairly accurate portrayal of a light cavalryman from the Polish-Lithuanian frontier in the mid-17th century when Rembrandt painted the picture. And we think we know who it was. It was possibly Marcin Ogiński, who was visiting the Netherlands at the same sort of period that the picture was painted. He's armed like a cavalryman with bow and arrow and saber, and that war hammer that was used by these units of light cavalry. Now, it is this use of cavalry in Poland-Lithuania which has led many historians to argue that Poland-Lithuania was somehow backward, that it missed the great military developments of the early modern period, and that therefore this clearly played a great role in the disappearance of Poland-Lithuania as a state in the 18th century. Now, today, I want to contest that view of Polish-Lithuanian military history and suggest a rather different picture. So let's begin with a concept that has been very controversial among historians of the early modern period, the military revolution, the idea that was first announced by, or put forward by, Professor Michael Roberts of Queen's University Belfast in his inaugural lecture in 1956, that between 1560 and 1660, a military revolution took place. And he was a Swedish historian, or a historian of Sweden, who wrote a 2-volume biography of this man, Gustav II Adolf, King of Sweden between 1611 and 1632. And this is what Michael Roberts wrote. It remains true that purely military developments of a strictly technical kind did exert a lasting influence upon society at large. They were the agents and auxiliaries of constitutional and social change, and they bore a main share of responsibility for the coming of that new world, which was to be so very unlike the old. He went on to argue that the armies of Maximilian II, Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, in tactics, strategy, constitution, and spirit, belonged to a world of ideas, and note the use of the world of ideas, which would have seemed quite foreign to Benedek and Radetzky, the great Austrian generals of the 19th century. Well, not so great, actually, but never mind. The armies of the Great Elector are linked infrangibly with those of Moltke and Schlieffen. By 1660, the modern art of war had come to birth. And he goes on to describe what he means by the modern art of war. And his argument was that it was these developments, these technical developments, that brought the great changes in state and society, the emergence of the modern state and the modern international system. Now, I was taught at St Andrews by this man, Geoffrey Parker, a great military historian of the Dutch wars against Spain in the 17th century. And it was, in fact, Geoffrey who suggested, when I was going for him for a reference for the summer school in Krakow in 1979, he said, "Oh, are you thinking of writing a PhD on Polish history?" And I said, "Perhaps." And he said, "No, please do, because we all know Poland-Lithuania was terribly important, but we don't know anything about it because we can't read the language." And so he has a great deal to do with my becoming a Polish historian, and a military historian. But Geoffrey wrote an extension of the Michael Roberts theory, a book called The Military Revolution, in which he argued this: the wars fought on the eastern half of the great European plain remained deeply resistant to military innovation. And this was because he looked at Eastern Europe and he did not see what he saw in the wars he knew, the wars between France, Spain, the Dutch Republic, the wars of the Three Kingdoms in the British Isles. The Roberts thesis basically said this, that the coming of gunpowder from the 15th century rendered the old style of medieval warfare irrelevant, based on heavy cavalry, based on knights in armor with foot soldiers. But by the early 16th century, this form of warfare was no longer tenable. Gunpowder and the use of pikes to give defensive strength had destroyed the central position of heavy armed cavalry on the battlefield. And that withdrew the cap on army size. Infantry was much cheaper than fully armored knights, and therefore battle tactics changed irrevocably. Geoffrey extended this by stressing the importance of gunpowder in siege warfare. The old thin castle walls or quite thick stone walls of castles in the medieval period could not withstand the bronze cannon and the iron cannonballs, and then the cast iron cannon of the 16th and 17th century. They were knocked down, but new systems of fortifications, angle bastions spread across Europe, new artillery fortifications that could resist cannon, and this led to another increase in army size. And because you needed a very large army to take one of these fortresses. And it was this transition, Geoffrey argued, that Poland, Lithuania, and Russia missed, Russia at least until the 18th century, because Polish-Lithuanian armies remained based on cavalry, based on the sort of riders seen in Rembrandt's famous painting. Well, today I want to challenge that view and suggest that Poles and Lithuanians knew very well what was going on in the rest of Europe in military terms, that they were well able of adapting their technology to Polish-Lithuanian conditions. But the wars they fought were fought in a very different context from the wars in the Dutch Republic, as it became, the wars in France, the wars in Britain. The great enemies of those fighting in the East, and this is as relevant today as we have found out since last February, as it was in the 16th and 17th century. The great problem is that Eastern Europe is vast. There is great space there, and fighting has to be undertaken in a rather different way. And I will develop that theme as we go on. But let's start in 1514 with the great Lithuanian victory at the Battle of Orsha, when a much larger Muscovite army was destroyed. And as you see from this picture, the Polish-Lithuanian forces, it's led by a Lithuanian, Ostrogski, but they are, the forces are quite a large amount of, have quite a large amount of Poles in them. They're armored. They look like a West European army. It's the Russians on the left of the picture who are clad in a different way. You will see a cannon coming across the bridge at the front. Now, this is a painting that it is believed that whoever painted it was actually present at the battle or was present at military maneuvers of the day. But if we look here in the painting, we see something quite interesting. Light cavalrymen with lances and shields, dressed as if they look rather like French or Italian noblemen. Slightly Eastern style to their costumes. But these are the first ancestors of the Polish-Lithuanian Hussars. 100 years later, they look very, very different. These are the Hussars that escorted Sigismund III Vasa's second wife into Krakow in 1605 from the Stockholm Roll. The famous winged Hussars, gorgeously apparelled in half armor with their long lances. These were highly technically developed cavalry, shock cavalry in an age when the rest of Europe had abandoned shock cavalry. What your European cavalrymen did after the coming of the infantry tactics of pike and shot was to develop tactics of pursuit. They were armed with pistols or carbines. And there was a wonderful maneuver they practiced called the caracole, in which they trotted up to the enemy army, fired their pistols or their carbines, and then wheeled away and trotted to the back of the rank and trotted in again. We'll hear a little more about the caracole later on. But the Hussars did not. They charged home. And I should stress that this cavalry was developed specifically to fight against Western armies and against the Ottoman Turks. And very effective they were up until the early 18th century, when musket technology and the development of the flintlock rendered them less effective than they had been. And there's somebody waiting to join. I'll just admit them. I don't know if you can admit them, Yaroslav, but I will admit them.
It's okay, I've admitted them. I look
You've
after
admitted them. Okay, so if you can handle that, that's fine. I was admitting them when you were speaking. Okay. The Poles knew about Western technology, and from the 1630s on, they divided their armies into a national contingent and a foreign contingent. And the foreign contingent fought in the Western style. Some of them were from the West, a lot of Scots among them, but many of them were from the German-speaking urban territories of the Polish-Lithuanian Republic in the north, in Royal Prussia and along the Baltic coast in Livonia. But I'm going to speak a bit about the national contingent first, because one of the differences between the way the Polish-Lithuanian armies were organized and the way Western armies were organized were that the hierarchy of officers, from colonels through captains, majors, lieutenants, ensigns, and so on, that developed in Western armies in the 16th and 17th centuries, did not develop in the national contingent, the Autorament Narodowy, in the Polish-Lithuanian armies. These were units, both cavalry and infantry, that were raised under a rotmistrz, a captain. The colonel would pay for the regiment, but the rotmistrz was the man in charge of it, on the comrade system, towarzysz system, whereby a nobleman would raise his own retinue, his poczet, of 2 to 3 men who he armed and equipped and brought to the unit. And the rotmistrz would have a larger poczet of about 6 to 8 men. And it was these men who formed companies in the cavalry of about 250 to 200 men, which had, in effect, each towarzysz was a kind of officer. And the unit took decisions in many respects democratically. There was a koło, a circle that discussed what they were going to do. There was collective decision making. So there was not the hierarchy of command that you saw in Western armies. And the infantry units that fought in the national contingent, Polish and Hungarian units, were organized in the same way and were frequently staffed by nobles. It was different in the foreign contingent of the army, where the standard Western hierarchy in the infantry units and in the cavalry units, such as the reiters, or the sort of mixed units, the dragoons, which were units of infantry that traveled around on horse. They had the standard hierarchical system of officers. But one of the features of the Polish system, which seemed different to Western Europe, and these are so-called jazda pancerna, armored cavalry. Until 1648, they called them jazda kozacka, Cossack cavalry, which has caused a great deal of confusion in certain military histories of the West. They assume that these Cossacks were Ukrainian Zaporozhian Cossacks, which they were not. Cossack cavalry units were something entirely different, raised from among the Polish-Lithuanian and Ruthenian nobility. But the great question is professionalism, because the Polish-Lithuanian armies were raised for campaigns. They did not seem to make the transition to the standing army. There was a small standing army from the 1560s, the quarter army, which served in the Ukraine, about 3,000 to 4,000 men, who garrisoned some of the Ukrainian forts. But it was, as I say, in comparison to Western armies of the time, it seemed very, very small indeed. And soldiers, officers, served for short periods, and the number of officers who served for a long periods, even in the second half of the 17th century, was fairly small, and Polish historians are concerned about this. So most who joined the national contingent only served for up to 10 years, and most of them, the vast majority of those, only served for 1 or 2 years. So this did not seem like the professional armies that we know from Western Europe. So why was Poland-Lithuania different? Here's the foreign contingent, and as you can see, they look exactly like the Western soldiers, and they fought like Western soldiers. So why did Poland-Lithuania fight differently, and how effective was it? And I would like to argue that it was pretty effective. First of all, it is a myth that in Eastern Europe they knew nothing of West European fortification systems. Here's a contemporary depiction of Danzig. Danzig, which raised its own troops up to 3,000 and more, was surrounded with an entirely modern set of fortifications. Here you see the system of angle bastions and walls in some of its fullest development. And Georg Förster, who was born in Danzig, wrote one of the classic books on fortification systems in the mid-17th century, published in 1648. And this is Zamość. Zamość has a complete set, a wonderful set of Renaissance fortifications. This is a picture I took when I walked around them one early morning. And you can see the angle bastion, the brick walls that absorbed cannon fire rather than shattering as stone walls did, the covered way with a glacis on the other side so that you hid your fortress below the level of the ground so that the enemy approaching it couldn't actually see your bastions, and you swept that field of fire to prevent the enemy approaching. This is Zamość from the air, and you can see it's one of the few early modern fortresses that actually you can still see the complete set of fortifications, which are designed as a whole to keep the enemy as far away as possible from the walls of the city, and very effective they were. It took a great deal of effort and a very large army to take such fortifications, and Zamość was not taken by the Swedes, it was not taken by the Muscovites, and it was not taken by the Cossacks. But the difference is that Poland-Lithuania was a republic and not a monarchy and not a state. And I'd like to stress this, and it's the reason that I've called my second volume, which I'm nearly finishing, The Making of the Polish-Lithuanian Republic. It was a Renaissance republic, and part of the point I would like to make is that we should not judge Poland-Lithuania for not becoming what it never tried to be. What did being a republic mean? Well, if we look at the key clause of the Union of Lublin, written in Polish, not in Latin, that the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania already form one indivisible and uniform body and are not distinct, but compose one common republic, which has been constituted and formed into one people out of two states, and they use the modern Polish word for state, and two nations. This is a republic of citizens, not an abstract state in the sense that comes into use in the rest of Europe in the 16th century. A state is an abstract body, and from the time of Jean Baudin in the 1570s, his great 6 books of the Republic, it is argued that sovereignty is indivisible. Well, that's not the case in the Polish-Lithuanian Republic. It is a republican system in the Renaissance sense, a system of mixed government. And here you see an allegory of that system of mixed government. The 3 elements of the constitution balance each other. The king on his throne at the back, the Senate sitting round on chairs in the center, and the populace, the lud. And if we go back one, the word for one people, if you look at the Polish, it says jeden lud. Now that was used in the sense of the Latin populace, the body of citizens, the people. And this is a citizen system. It is a mixed system of government formed of a self-governing citizen community. It is not conceived as an abstract state. And the Henrician Articles of 1573, which Henry of Valois very cleverly managed not to swear to, they were first sworn to by Stefan Batory in 1576, entrenched legally the institutions of self-government, the semiques and the same, the local castle and land courts, and of course included the famous clause about de non prestanda obedientia, the right of the citizen body to withdraw its loyalty to the king if he breached his coronation oath. The king was not sovereign. This did not mean that the Schlachter, the nobility, was sovereign. This was not a system that worried much about where power lay, and it rejected Baudin's idea that sovereignty was indivisible and must rest in one place with the king. Sovereignty, authority was shared throughout the system. In the last analysis, the citizen community had final authority if the king breached his oath, but it was the king's job to govern, and he was commander-in-chief of the military system, and he was regulated by the law. Lex est rex, as they said, the law is king. Now, this created a very uncentralized system, and it was uncentralized from the start. Polish historians talk about the decentralization of the system, which was meant to have sapped the power of the king and therefore the military power of the republic, the Commonwealth. But here we have a system based on the Senate with its Catholic bishops, the palatines of Voivodovie, one starosta of Samogitia, and the major and minor castellans, and the government ministers, and then the Chamber of Envoys. There were separate governments for the two separate states of Poland and Lithuania, and of course they each had separate armies. But ultimately it was the semiques who constituted the Chamber of Envoys, and here are the semiques, about 54 of them, and they could agree to, reject, and approve of anything voted in the Sejm, including taxes. It seems like a complex system, and it was a complex system. And it is argued that this system, particularly after the institutionalization of the liberum veto after 1652, that this system descended into anarchy and chaos. Now, there is much truth in that, for a while anyway, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I want to talk about the way that the military system is solidly based on this uncentralized system. The army was not a state army, a standing state army in the sense that it was in the West. It was a citizen army. And Poles and Lithuanians were very taken with Machiavelli's famous book on the art of war, Libro dell'arte della guerra, which he wrote, in which he argued that a mercenary army, an army hired to fight for money, was not nearly as effective as an army of citizens who wished to defend their country. The sort of thing we say about the Ukrainian army today. The problem with the Russian army is that it's a conscript army that doesn't really want to fight, whereas the Ukrainians are fighting as citizens to defend their territory. And the army was a highly complex thing. The Pospolite Ruszenie was the basis of the army. It was in 1454 that Kazimierz Jagiellończyk had to accept that he could not mobilize the Szlachta, the nobility, to fight, to defend the Kingdom of Poland without the consent of the semiques. And the Pospolite Ruszenie, you were meant to be, as a noble, have the duty to come out and defend your state against an invader. But now the semiques had to consent to it. And military historians will tell you that the Pospolite Ruszenie was militarily useless by the 16th and 17th centuries. And to an extent that's true, though I'm not sure that it was as true of the southeastern Palatinates, Rus and the Ukrainian Palatinates, as is sometimes suggested. But in any case, what the Pospolite Ruszenie, which mustered every so often, every few years at the local level did, was to show that the citizens would muster, turn out with the arms that were necessary to defend the Republic. And you could call out the Pospolite Ruszenie in time of danger, but it almost never was. Defense was carried out by the quarter army, this army of 3,000 to 4,000, which only existed in Poland, never in Lithuania, which was supported by a fifth of the revenue from the royal estates, the Królewszczyzna. You had the Zaporozhian Cossacks down to 1648. The Cossack register, depending on various matters, between 5,000 and 9,000 from the 1580s on, but there were a large number of non-registered Cossacks, up to 40,000, who could be called out in time of need. And then if you had a war, you had the supplementary army, as it was first called, later called the Komput, the Wojsko Komputowe, which was based on the word for budget. This was an army which was controlled by the Sejm, which decided on the budget and provided the taxes, in theory, to pay for it. These were professional troops raised according to need. From 1562, the supplementary and the Komput army were merged. Then you had another set of units called the district units, the Chorągwie Powiatowe, which were raised directly by the Sejmiks. And I'll come back to those because they are rather more important, I would suggest, than historians have sometimes argued. Now, strategy is what I am going to talk about today. And Machiavelli, whose works were more popular in Poland than people think, he was on the index, so you weren't officially allowed to read him, but people did. To await the enemy, to await the enemy's attack, he says, has many advantages, without any disadvantages to yourself. You can impose on him many disadvantages in the matter of provisions. You can better thwart his plans, owing to your having a better knowledge of the country than he has. And you can oppose him with stronger forces, owing to the ease with which you can assemble them. Now, I think you could cite that clause looking at the Ukrainian conflict today and the astonishing way in which it has proceeded. And in many respects, the Russian experience since the 23rd of February indicates why the Polish-Lithuanian Republic's system of defense worked in a way that a Western system would not have worked. The great problem in Poland-Lithuania is distance. It is a huge country, 1 million square kilometers at its height in the 1630s. It was a composite system, a composite republic with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Royal Prussia incorporated into the Kingdom of Poland in the 15th century, Livonia, which was run as a condominium of Poland and Lithuania from the 1590s, and the Ukrainian Palatinates. This shows the post-Lublin map when the three Ukrainian Palatinates of Volhynia, Bratslav, and Kyiv were transferred from Lithuania to Poland, not annexed. They all signed separate acts of union with the Kingdom of Poland in 1569, which protected their liberties and rights. It's a decentralized, uncentralized system, as I say, and that, I would suggest, required an uncentralized system of defense. You could be fighting wars, as you were at various points, on two fronts, 3,000 kilometers apart, up in the Baltic against the Swedes or the Muscovites, and down in the southeast against the Tatars and the Ottoman Empire. And the Tatars play a very important important role in the development of the Polish-Lithuanian system, because the Tatars do not fight, the Crimean Tatars do not fight, and they bring in hordes from the steppe land, Bujaks and others. And from the 1490s on, right through down into the second half of the 17th centuries, they mount large-scale raids almost every year on the Commonwealth, on the Republic, down various routes into the Republic. And their aim is this: to capture slaves for the Ottoman slave market. There are something like 2 million Polish, Russian, Ruthenian individuals taken away in the early modern period to be sold on the Ottoman slave markets. And the way the Tatars fought was unusual. They came in sometimes every year, not always they could raise about 20 to 30,000 men if they brought the full horde in, but they didn't usually send in quite so many. but they sent units that would form a Coops, a sort of base somewhere in Ukraine, and it was what is now Ukraine, and it would vary from year to year. From there, they would fan out into fast-moving cavalry units. They did not conduct sieges. They did not have cannon. And you had to have small responsive units that would go out and meet them, units of cavalry that would reconnoiter, find out where they were, and try and retake the slaves that they were taking away. And you used this with the cavalry that you raised on the local level, and the infantry, largely infantry in the quarter army, and the Zaporozhian Cossacks. This is a relief from the tomb of Jan Kazimierz in Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, showing that the Zaporozhian Cossacks fight on foot. They provide much of the infantry that the Polish army needs when it fights Western armies and when it fights the Ottoman Empire. And they use the Tabor, the Wagenburg, as it's known in German, these field fortifications that they can set up in Ukraine in the vast open steppes if they're threatened by a larger force of cavalry or whatever. And they dig in, they link their wagons, they build field fortifications round the camp. And this is how war is conducted on the vast open empty steppe lands, because that's the other feature of war in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is far more sparsely populated than the West. The Dutch Republic has a fat village or town round every corner, and as does Germany in the 30 Years' War. And a modern Western army can go in and feed itself by capturing little fortifications, little towns and villages, and raising contributions. You can't do that on the steppe. You can't do that in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The terrain does not allow for it. And cavalry controls the terrain. Cavalry is mobile and can sweep around. And this is an illustration that shows it. These are Scottish Highlanders, not Irishmen, as the German headline tells you. These are recruited into Szczecin in 1631 by Gustav Adolf. Gustav Adolf, when he fights in Poland with his Western-style Swedish army, transformed by him, a very, very good army. In the 1620s, he comes in, but he cannot break out of Royal Prussia because the Poles, with their cavalry, control the theater of war. He actually enlists bowmen, archers, because an infantry unit on the march with a matchlock musket, matches burn very quickly. An infantry unit can only have 1 man in 10 with its match lit. And if a cavalry unit comes over the horizon when they're on the march, and the Swedish cavalry is pretty useless when it comes up against Polish-Lithuanian cavalry, then the infantry unit is dead meat. Now, this means that in the interior of Poland, as Carl Gustav X, Charles X of Sweden finds in the 1650s, he can't control the landscape, the terrain, as he does in Germany, by taking strategic towns and then using those towns as a base from which he can send out his troops to raise supplies and provisions, because the Polish cavalry control the land, the theater of war. That's why cavalry is needed. It's not on the battlefield. When they have to, they can defend from modern fortifications. This is the great key point in wars against the Ottomans. And these are photographs I took in Chocim in a few years back, which show the extent of the fortifications there, because the Turks bring modern cannon and modern musket technology. So you have to have strong points on the southern frontier that you do defend. And in 1621, at the Battle of Chotin, the Battle of Chocim, there the Poles, the Lithuanians do defend against a massive Turkish army. And they raise something like 60 to 70,000, including 40,000 Zaporozhian Cossacks. And this is a modern depiction of that battle in the modern town of Chotin. It is huge. It is a massive spread of countryside. And yet the Poles and the Lithuanians defend themselves there. And this is why, this is the commander who actually dies during the Battle of Khotyn, Jan Karol Chodkiewicz, the great Lithuanian hetman. This is what he says about strategy with regard to the Muscovites. The army should not sit dispersed on hilltops, but should be with the king, seeking to destroy the Muscovites at one blow. Their garrisons can be ignored, but if the Lord grants us victory, all these chicken coops can be safely ignored. What's the point of having men sitting in a fort on the top of a hill, an old castle, if they can't go anywhere? We can pick them off one by one once we've dealt with the large Muscovite army that comes in, as we did at Orsha in 1514, and as the Ukrainians did in February when that great column of tanks set off for Kyiv. What could it do? It got stuck. It couldn't do anything, and the Ukrainians could pick it off. This is what the Swedes found. There's a wonderful account in a contemporary Swedish diary of a troop that gets down and takes the castle at Landskrona, down in Małopolska, and they sit there and they're terrified. They can't control the town, they can't control the countryside, the cavalry marauds around, and they're starving. What can they do? On the battlefield, it works, and this was the strategy. This is the Battle of Kirchholm, where Chodkiewicz, from the previous picture, with an army of 3,000, mostly cavalry, defeats a very large much larger Swedish force, 13,000. The Swedes have pikes, they have all the modern muskets, but they are destroyed and swept back to Riga. And of that 13,000, something like 8,600 are killed because the infantry break and try to run the 10 kilometers back to Riga and are slaughtered. And the citizens of Riga come out and count them into the grave. At the Battle of Klushino, where the Hussars come into their own against Western cavalry, a much larger Russian force, Muscovite force, which has a substantial contingent of Swedes, Germans, Scots, and English soldiers, is destroyed by Żółkiewski. And here you see an illustration of the cavalry charges, and this is what a participant writes about it. And he's describing the caracol. They handed us the victory. They came at us. We were in disorder, and immediately, having fired their carbines, they wheeled away to the rear in their normal fashion. That's the caracol, to reload. And the next rank advanced firing. We did not wait, but at the moment, all had emptied their pieces, and seeing that they were starting to withdraw, we charged them with only our sabers in our hands. They, having failed to reload while the next rank had not yet fired, took to their heels. We crashed into the whole Muscovite force, still drawn up in battle order, at the entrance to their camp, plunging them into disorder, and they entered the camp and just swept through it. A massive victory. But this is the one which perhaps best matches the Russians attacking in February. This was at Smolensk. Smolensk was the great gateway, the great fortress, the equivalent of Chochim in the south, that guarded the Republic. It was taken back by Sigismund. It was taken by the Muscovites in 1513, just before the Battle of Orsha, and it was taken back by Sigismund III in 1611. And in 1634, when Sigismund dies, the Muscovites decide, right, there's going to be an election. We shall try and take Smolensk back. And so they send a great column of troops in to besiege Smolensk, and the garrison holds out for 18 months. In 1632, Władysław IV is elected, and it takes 18 months for him to call for the same to vote the taxes, for the taxes to be gathered, for the army to be assembled, and the Zaporozhian Cossacks come up. And finally, in 1634, 18 months later, the army comes to Smolensk, and it does what the Ukrainians did to that column of tanks. It controls the theater of war. The Muscovites are shut up in a fortified tabor, in a fortified camp, and starved into surrender. And here we have the moment when the Russian commander, Schein, and his generals grovel at the feet of Władysław IV, the figure in red at the center, who marches his horse forward to put his hooves on the Russian standards. And he keeps them there for 5 minutes. Again, we have a diary that describes the scene. He keeps them there for 5 minutes and says, okay, you can go now. He sends them back to Moscow in disgrace, And of course, because they've surrendered to the Polish army, Schein and his generals are executed. Some Russian ways of treating their unsuccessful generals don't change. Now, it all comes, I'm not going to say much about what happens after 1648, because that's the period in which this system starts to break down. And I can answer, I can say in questions why that happens, if you're interested. But I would like to concentrate on 1648 for another reason. Khmelnytsky's revolt is catastrophic in many ways, socially, in terms of the Commonwealth and its defense, because it effectively deprives it of those 40,000 Cossacks that it had used in times of danger up to 1648. But what I want to talk about now is the response to what happens in 1648, which anybody who's seen the film Ogniem i Mieczem will know about. In 1648, the Cossacks move in, they rebel, they bring in their Tatar allies. The Tatar horde comes in full strength. And in 3 great battles, at Żółte Wody, Korsun, and Piljavci, they destroy the Crown Army, the professional army, led by a drunkard, Potocki. He divides his army up, which is much smaller than the Cossack force, and it's completely destroyed. Where are the defenses of the Commonwealth? Well, this is where the district companies come in, the chorągwie powiatowe. Now, the suggestion that historians used to have, and that is there in Sienkiewicz, is that it was a pospolite ruszenie, which goes to Piljavci and drinks itself into a stupor and is overrun. Well, that's not true, because these were professional forces raised by the Sejmiks. And in this period, between 1648 and 1717, the Sieradzk Sejmik alone votes taxes for professional troops on 44 occasions. And in the summer of 1648, the Sejmiks raised 15,000 men from a standing start, professional men, who go and they fight at Piljavci. And the defeat at Piljavci was due to failure of command, not a failure of the troops. The leadership, for reasons I can go into in questions, was hopeless. So they raised 15,860 men, 11,600 cavalry, but also 4,260 infantry. Now, the rates of pay of these professional men paid for by the Sejmiks, and the length of service is longer. The Lublin Sejmik in the second half of the 17th century pays 80 zlotys per quarter for a hussar, the most expensive form of cavalry. The state pays 40. Now, and for much of the second half of the 17th century, colonels of armored cavalry units, the Jazda Pancerna, paid up to 10 times as much as the state army pays. Now, up until recently, Polish military historians ignored these units and said, well, they're not a proper army, they're not a state standing army, therefore we'll not count them. And we are beginning to know much more about these district companies. Some of them were not very good because they were raised in a hurry. Some of them were very good. This is what Albrecht Stanisław Radziwiłł says in 1634 in his great diary. He says, so great a zeal for the conservation of liberty arose that within 6 weeks, he's talking about the Pinsk Sejmik in what's now southern Belarus, within 6 weeks, money for 400 hussars, that is a huge number of the most expensive form of cavalry, and 600 light cavalry for half a year was raised. Other districts, fired by fortunate jealousy and rivalry, tried to do the same. So there was competition to make sure that you weren't letting the country down. And the efficacy of this system was shown, as I draw to a conclusion, in Potop, the deluge between 1655 and 1656, when the whole country seems to be collapsing, the whole republic is collapsing. The Lithuanians have collapsed in August 1655 against the Muscovites. Vilnius is taken in a siege, and that blue line shows the extent of the penetration of the Muscovite and the Cossack armies in the summer of 1655. Then the Swedes come in from 2 directions, from Pomerania, from Pomorze, and from Livonia. And the Crown Army surrenders to them, and the king escapes into Silesia. But the citizens rapidly discover that neither the Muscovites nor the Swedes will uphold their republican system. And so they start resisting. And the decentralized system enables the Poles to push the Swedes back and eventually to end the war successfully with Austrian help and eventually Brandenburg, Prussian help in 1660. They can then turn and push back the Muscovites out of most of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Ukraine enters the period known as Ruina, where Ukraine is torn between Muscovy and Poland, Lithuania. Most of the right bank, except Kyiv, is taken back by Poland, Lithuania, but the left bank in Kyiv remains in Muscovite hands, a key moment in European history. The second half of the 17th century, as I suggest, apart from Sobieski and Vienna, turns into something of a problem. They lose Podolia during the wars against the Turks in the early 1670s and only take it back in 1699. And then there's the Great Northern War, which is effectively a Polish-Lithuanian civil war, but I can say more about that afterwards. But the idea of the citizen army survives. And if the strategy is a sensible one, if I can come back to Parker, this is what he says about strategy. Not every grand strategy is aggressive, however, nor does it merely involve war. Rather, each encompasses the decisions of a given state about its overall security, the threats it perceives, the ways it confronts them, and the steps it takes to match ends and means. Well, Poland-Lithuania, I have argued, has a different context, a different political system, and it takes the steps to match the ends and means pretty successfully down to 1648. And then again, by the end of the 18th century, suddenly citizen armies are back in vogue. The French Revolution has raised a citizen army to defeat the Ancien Regime armies of Prussia and Austria who invade France in 1792. And in Poland at the same time, Tadeusz Kościuszko calls out the citizens to defend Poland-Lithuania. Again, with some success, but ultimately the Commonwealth fails. But I would argue that it is not essentially a military failure. And I can say more about that in questions afterwards. But thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much. We could get out of your shared screen. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. You raised so many themes there, Robert. It's hard to know where to start. Could I just not start from one particular case? There's one particular slide that caught my attention, the Battle of Kirchholm.
Yeah.
If I remember the picture correctly, you have the infantry and infantry squares, and the cavalry defeat the infantry squares. So what was the difference between that and the Battle of Waterloo, where the infantry squares were able to withstand the cavalry, or was it the musket was the difference? Musket
technology and discipline and drill are far different by Waterloo. From about the late 17th century, by the 1690s, most infantry armies in Western armies have flintlock muskets. Flintlock muskets have a much better rate of fire. They so you can reduce the number of ranks you need in a square. They are not so prone to the problems of, a matchlock, you're basically holding a lighted match into a pan of gunpowder. They're pretty useless if the day is damp and wet, and damp and wet days are not unknown in Northern Europe. And they take much longer to load and fire. By Waterloo, you are also beginning to have rifle units. They know about rifles way back. They use them for hunting, but rifles take a very long time to load. You need to pack the ball down the musket. You've got to have wads and ramrods and all the rest of it. And that's why infantry units at the time of Kirchholm need pikes to protect them, because on their own, they can't resist cavalry. By 1690s, the tide has turned. The Poles succeed at Vienna, partly because it's a surprise attack. They sweep down on the Ottomans. The Ottomans are not fully prepared. But at Kliszów, when Charles XII of Sweden comes in, his troops have pikes and flintlock muskets. And the charge of Lubomirski's hussars at Kliszów is a bit of a disaster. They're shot down. and they cannot penetrate with their lances. Hussars, the classic hussars, have very long lances that are very rigid but quite light. They're not like medieval lances. They're made from a special wood, I think it's aspen wood, which is quite rigid but also light. They're designed to shatter at first first engagement, and then you use your kontusz, which is a long, thin rapier-like sword, which is about 4 or 5 feet long. It's a sort of ersatz lance. The Swedes adopt that tactic, having fought the Poles. Charles XII employs a Swedish version of the kontusz. And so these are very sophisticated troops, but by the end of the 17th century, they can't compete as they did, and the Hussars go, you know, they're finished as an effective fighting force. By the time of Waterloo, you have riflemen, you have muskets that you can fire quickly, and the great cavalry charges cannot.
Yeah. Digressing slightly, it has been suggested somewhat facetiously that actually, just focusing on Waterloo for a second, the British would have done better if they had the sort of bowmen they'd had at the Battle of Agincourt, because they didn't make smoke and they could have actually reached a further range than the muskets. That has been suggested.
Well, it's been suggested, but it's not. I mean, the problem with the longbow, you know, I always ask my students, okay, let's look at the 3 great battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, where the Welsh archers destroy the French. And you say, why does the rest of Europe not employ the longbow if it's such a damn good weapon? And the reason is that the draw strength of the longbows used at Agincourt is about 120 pounds. Most modern archers couldn't draw a bow that was more than 60 pounds draw weight. Half of that to penetrate plate armor, and you need 120 pounds of draw strength, which means you've got to be an Olympic athlete to draw the thing. You've got to be really, really strong. They dug up the archers' bodies off the Mary Rose that sank in the Solent under Henry VIII, and they were deformed because of their huge shoulder muscles on their right arms.
Is that correct? We've actually done that kind of research. Wow.
Yeah, so you couldn't actually deploy archers in the numbers that you would have needed at Waterloo, where, you know, there's 70,000 in the army.
Right. And yet your fake Irishmen there, who are in fact Scotsmen, fake Scotsmen, 3 of them had bows. Yeah, because they can fire quickly. They can accompany a column of. I mean, they weren't deployed in large numbers, but Gustav Adolf sort of thought, well, it would be good to have some bowmen, because the problem is if you're caught out, and it would be light cavalry. You know, you use your hussars on your battlefield. They're not the ones who roam the countryside. Right.
It's your light cavalry, which are usually Lithuanian Tatars or Moldavians, your medium cavalry, which is the Cossack cavalry or the armored cavalry later on, the Panzerna. They're the ones perhaps wearing that sort of chain mail that we saw, but usually just wearing, you know, sort of quite thick coats. They're the ones that move around quickly and threaten the infantry columns. They're the ones that you can deploy archers against still quite effectively.
I have a question. Yeah, I have a question here from Neil, just following on this subject of breaking squares. He said, is it better comparison for the breaking of these squares, the breaking of the Spanish tercios at Rocroi after being worn down by gunfire? You know, Rocroi was the famous battle where the French finally managed to use gunfire. That's what Gustav Adolf and Western armies were trying to do. Basically, you had the pikes in the middle, and your shot was a sleeve around it. And when the cavalry approached, the shot basically melted away behind the pikes, and the pikes deployed. What Gustav Adolf did was break down the large tercios. I mean, the Spaniards would have 2,000 to 3,000 men in a large block. Gustav Adolf broke them down into smaller brigades that he deployed in a very effective way. I mean, musket technology was getting better. In 1600, you had to have a rest for your musket. It was so heavy because of the weight you needed to have a ball that could penetrate a breastplate. By 1632, you didn't. So the muskets were lighter. They packed a greater punch.
by the end of the century, they pack a still greater punch. So yeah, I mean, Kirchholm, the muskets were not effective. They were swept aside. And the whole point of the Hussars' lances was they were long enough to reach infantry with a pike. And they just broke the infantry.
Get in among there. Tomek Porkovic asks, he says, being a fully Scottish-side Pole, for many years I've been interested in the history of Scots in Poland. It's over 400 years history of both countries that's not very well known. Is it possible in the future you would like to give us a lecture on that subject? Is that something you've...
I can certainly do that. I mean, I've published an article on the Scots fighting in this period in Polish armies. There were not as many of them as the Poles wanted because the Swedes kept stopping them coming through the Baltic. But
didn't give them visas, you mean, or something? Didn't give them visas, didn't let them through.
No. I mean, you can only get into the Baltic through the Sound, which the Danes and the Swedes control, and the Swedes intercepted boats. But I mean, there were Scots in the Polish army in 1621 at Chotin, an Irishman as well. So there were quite a few, and of course, Sienkiewicz put Hetling, Kessling, von Elgin into Pan Wołodyjowski. But I can tell you, I drove through Elgin yesterday, and there are not many people in Elgin. In fact, there are no people in Elgin called either Hetling or Kessling. So Sienkiewicz's search was not great.
You look through the phone book. Of course, there aren't phone books anymore.
No.
Well, why would they have confused the Scots for Irish?
Well, because there was a good reason for it, because the Gaelic-speaking Scottish Highlands along the west coast, which I've just come back from, I mean, in the Highlands of Scotland, you didn't move around by land because there were no roads. You moved around by water because there's lots of lochs and so on. And of course, a lot of the Gaelic culture was based on the islands, and it was as easy to get to the north of Ireland, where before the 17th century, the MacDonnells of Antrim were closely linked to the MacDonalds, who controlled much of the west of Scotland. So there was a Gaelic-speaking community that transcended across the Irish Sea. I mean, the name for Scots Gaelic is still Erse, which means Irish. So that was a Gaelic culture. The clearance of the Highlands has completely changed in the 18th century and early 19th century. Has completely changed the cultural geography of Scotland.
I see that the emails that come from you from the University of Aberdeen have what I assume is Scottish Gaelic on the bottom.
Yeah,
does anyone speak that today? Sorry, I digressed off the main subject.
There's still about 50,000 Gaelic speakers in Scotland.
Sorry, 55?
50,000, of which I don't know that was a figure from about 10 years ago. It's probably less than that now, fewer than that, because Gaelic is, I think a pretty high proportion of those are over the age of 60. Although it's very fashionable and there's great efforts to teach the language. In Aberdeen, you can go to Gaelic medium primary, where everything is taught in Gaelic.
Really?
Yeah, but, you know, I think it was only down to the First World War that you had people for whom Gaelic was their only language. There were still Scottish soldiers in the first.
The way to keep a minority in language alive is to have the majority language start hanging people who speak the minority language, and that, you know, as we saw in Spain, you know, that's
that was only done for a very short period for certain clans after the 45 in the 18th century, but it was more the economic pull. If you wanted to get a job or go to Glasgow or Edinburgh or America, you had to learn English.
Can we go back to the subject of Republican Commonwealth?
Yeah.
Would you like to address that in greater depth? Because time and time again, we read and we hear of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and you're saying quite clearly that's wrong.
Well, it's not wrong, but I mean, for many years I did the same, because Commonwealth was just the 17th century English translation of Res Publica, the Latin.
Right.
But I decided some time ago that I wanted to distinguish between the sort of republic that Poland-Lithuania had, which, as I said in the lecture, was a Renaissance republic based on the Aristotelian idea of the mixed system of government. You know, the rule of one, monarchy, the rule of the few or the best people, aristocracy, and the rule of the many, which Aristotle called polity, because each form tends to degenerate into its sort of degenerate form. So monarchy, unless it's checked, will develop into tyranny. Aristocracy, unless it's checked, will descend into oligarchy, and polity, the rule of the citizen body, will automatically descend into what Aristotle called democracy, which he thought was a bad thing, but we might call ochlocracy, mob rule. And the key.
Sorry, what was the word for mob rule?
Sorry?
What was the word for mob rule?
Ochlocracy, OCHLOCRACY.
Right. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. And the definition of what is a bad system of government in Aristotelian terms is it's carried out only in the interest of the individual or the group. So oligarchy, the group just takes decisions in their own interests. Tyranny, the king takes decisions in its own interest, and mob rule, certain rights such as property rights are not respected by the mob. So if you have a mixed system, each element tempers the other and ensures that they don't degenerate, which is the idea behind it. And the idea is that this ensures that the common good, the bonum commune, is the end. That's the end of government, to uphold the common good. And that was the whole point of self-government. Polish-Lithuanian Schlachters talk of their golden liberties, but they didn't conceive of them in the sense that a modern liberal would in the States or in Great Britain. You know, my individual liberty to do what I want to do. That they would have regarded as license and something to be avoided. Their liberties were communal. So the estate of the nobility, which was about 6 to 8% of the population, they were the liberties of their estate that were granted to them by law. A town, a city, had a different set of liberties. They were self-governing republics too, under Magdeburg law mostly, with their own system of Renaissance republicanism, which is why the cities tend to separate themselves out from the noble republic. Now, I make a difference, a contrast between that and what becomes known as republicanism after the English Revolution, when Cromwell and the opponents of Charles I put the king on trial and execute him. And a week before they execute him, they say, what are we going to do now? You know, we don't want Charles II to succeed. So they create the Commonwealth, the Respublica, but it's essentially a state. It's an abstract state. It's a monarchical system. Now, Machiavelli has said that there are two systems of government, a principality or a Respublica, a republic. And that's the modern idea. A republic is a system without a king. It's a state that doesn't have a king. But the Polish-Lithuanian Republic has a king who is regarded as essential for the good government of the system. I hope that answers the question.
Well, that's a very interesting distinction. Yeah, that's a very interesting distinction. Thank you for putting it in such a broader context. The modern art of war, just going back, would you like to elaborate a little more there on the modern art of war that you touched on briefly?
Well, yeah, I could have put in the next quote from the Michael Roberts article. Michael Roberts was not a military historian, he was a political historian.
Right.
And what he said was that by 1660, the modern art of war had come into being. And he was writing this 12 years after the end of the Second World War. So he said what the modern art of war means is, first of all, state armies. He's thinking about Prussia, about Germany, about the First World War, about the Second World War. He's thinking about total war, the full, and he calls it in all its, what's the term he used? You know, in all very negative terms for it, because he sees what's happened in the Second World War and the First World War. You know, state terror, mass conscription, the use of propaganda, the whipping up of loyalty to this abstract state, which has resulted in Nazism, which has resulted in the dreadful wars of the 20th century. That's what he's meaning. And he's saying, essentially, you can see this in 1660. The standing army, the institutionalization of permanent regiments, which we have from, you know, the oldest regiment in the British Army is, well, it's the Royal Scots and the Coldstream Guards, which are formed out of that period of Cromwellian rule. General Monk leads the army to accept Charles II in 1660. And then you can trace the Coldstream. Yeah, why do we have a Guards regiment that's named after a very small village in the Scottish borders?
Precisely, yes. I mean, in seniority, it's the second Guards regiment.
Second eldest, yeah. It's the Royal Scots claim seniority. They're called Pontius Pilate's bodyguard in the British Army.
I have another question for Neil, actually, who's going back to Italian history again. He said, I can't think of a direct equivalent to this Polish-Lithuanian system anywhere else. Is the Venetian Republic under a Doge somewhat analogous, albeit smaller?
Oh, indeed. And you know, a lot of Poland-Lithuania's political ideology derives from the great Italian republics of the late medieval period. So Genoa, Lucca, Venice, Florence, and so on. I mean, Machiavelli, of course, writes about really the destruction of the Florentine Republic by the Medici. And Venice is, you know, the Polish-Lithuanian Republic, I think, becomes, you know, the great republican hope for of many Italians from these republics that are going under one by one by the 16th century. And Venice is the last one that survives. Now, the University of Venice is Padua, and a very large number of Poles and Lithuanians, the wealthy nobility, go and study at Padua.
Interesting.
Jan Zamoyski goes to Padua, and he's elected rector of the legal faculty in Padua, because everybody gets together to make sure a German doesn't get it. And he writes a book on the Roman Senate that is also about, you know, the Polish-Lithuanian system in part. And so they imbibe that republican ideology in northern Italy. They say that they're different from Venice, because Venice they would have classed as almost a pure aristocracy, because the Doge has far less power and is only elected for a limited period compared with the kings. I mean, for all that a lot of the historiography says that the kings of Poland, Lithuania are stripped of their powers, they are not. And Poles know it. The king has potentially an enormous amount of power.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Well, we have sort of come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank you, Professor Frost, for an absolutely fascinating lecture, and the way you put it in a broader context, I personally found intellectually very, very stimulating. And once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning. It's been wonderful.
Well, thank you. I should say that the picture behind me is a contemporary engraving of the 1655 siege of Krakow by the Swedes.
It is Krakow, yeah, because it's
Krakow. They took it, and the Poles got it back.
Yeah, I can see some cannon. Yeah. On the right, actually, it's a cross, but it looks like a modern telegraph pole. But
it does, but it is a cross. It is a cross. It's a wonderful engraving by a man who was there, Eric Dahlberg, Swedish engraver.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. I could keep on, you know, peppering you with questions for a long time, but I think it's time to draw this to a close. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this morning. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you next week when Professor Richard Butterwick-Pawlikowski is talking about the Polish-Russian War of 1792. Is it 1792, I think?
Well, my last slide was a nice transition into that lecture.
Precisely. Well, once again, thank you all very much, and thank you, Professor Frost. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.